So today I'm going to talk about the climate change effects on marine fisheries, how that would affect fish stocks and the fisheries who are dependent on the fish stocks, and also people who are dependent on the fisheries. So the work is actually behind what I'm going to present collaborations from a lot of different authors. So I'm not able to acknowledge all of them, but then when I show particular results, I will also mention the colleagues who helped with producing those results that I'm going to show you in this presentation. So as I said, the chair already summarized very nicely the key messages that I want to talk about. So first of all, I will quickly summarize some of the key status of our understanding about what the observed climate impacts on marine ecosystems and fisheries. And then I will move on to talk about what the future would be, particularly informed by scenarios and models that a lot of my research are focusing on under climate change. And then lastly, I don't want to leave my talk with just pessimistic messages. I think there are still solutions out there and things that we can act on, and that we can turn the tide if we can act now and act decisively. So I will at the end mention a few of those solutions and some of the opportunities that are presented to us. I'm sure Professor Pauly have show you these figures from his plenary yesterday. This basically show us that the global fisheries productions of both marine fish and shellfish or invertebrates have peaked in the 1990s, and then in recent decades is stabilized or even declining slightly. So what it means is that even though if we fish harder with an increase in fishing effort, we are not able to actually get more fish out of the oceans. So it is an indication that we are already fully exploiting, or in many cases, overexploiting a lot of the fish stocks, at least the traditional fish stocks that our fisheries are targeting. So the scope for further increasing fisheries productions from fishing harder will be really limited, if not in a different direction. There was lots of excitement about aquaculture, and in this case, if we talk only about seafood, then it is farming, marine farming in the oceans. We call it mariculture. But then if we look at mariculture productions, it is in the last couple of decades, although it grows really rapidly, it's still a small portions of the global seafood production. And also, most of the mariculture productions are actually concentrated in a few countries, such as China, where they have a big investment into the development of aquaculture, while most of part of the other oceans or countries, the developments of mariculture and their production are still very limited compared to capture fisheries. So we still rely heavily on capture fisheries for our seafood production. But looking in the future, if the capacity of us catching fish from the ocean is basically, I think, is limited now. But then in addition to that, we are facing multiple human activities that are putting stress on the oceans that further limit the capacity of the oceans to provide fish and seafood for us. This includes overfishing, habitat destructions, pollutions, and more recently, we recognize that climate change is actually also one of the key drivers in affecting the capacity of the ocean in providing fish for us. And the thing is, all of these human drivers are actually interacting with one another, sometimes exacerbating the effects of the other one, making the problems much more complex and difficult to solve. We just look at climate change. I mean, the ultimate drivers of climate change is greenhouse gas or carbon dioxide emissions from human activities. The ocean is already doing a great service for us by absorbing a lot of carbon dioxide, basically almost 28% of the carbon dioxide that we emitted, as well as the ocean is a great heat capacitor. So it's absorbing over 90% of the heat that additional heat that we generated from the greenhouse effect. So without the oceans, basically our world would not be livable. But in doing this great service for us, the ocean is also being affected. And the main syndrome of changes in the ocean conditions that we have seen so far include ocean warming, ocean deoxygenations, ocean acidifications, and other aspects of ocean changes that are directly or indirectly related to these aspects. This is one of the key figures in the summary for policymakers in the IPCC report or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, special report for the oceans and the cryosphere, the changing climate, that was released in 2019. And these represent both historical observations of changes in ocean conditions and projections of the future change under two contrasting greenhouse gas emission scenarios. So the pink, the yellowish line here represent the historical period. We are already seeing ocean temperatures increasing. There's already a increase in the intensity of the marine heat waves. So it is not only mean temperature, but then these episodic extreme heat events are also increasing, which are bringing a lot of impacts on both ecosystems and human society as well. We are seeing a decrease in ocean pH, meaning the ocean is getting more acidic. We also observed a loss in oxygen content in global oceans, and that we know in the Arctic oceans that we are actually losing summer sea ice. And all of these changes are not only observed in the global scale, but then they can be actually observed in all of the ocean basin. If we just look at the tropical oceans, this is the synthesis in the IPCC report. The vertical or the different rows represent different types of impacts, from physical changes in ocean conditions to ecosystem change, and then to the impacts on the human communities that are dependent on the oceans. So we just look at the three tropical oceans, tropical Atlantic, tropical Indian Ocean, and tropical Pacific Oceans. We see that if you see the color in the column, it means that those changes or impacts are already observed. And then the dotted line represents the level of confidence on the observed impacts. So we are already, as I said, seeing all the physical and biogeochemical changes in this ocean basin, and that's impacts on some of the key ecosystems such as coral reef has been observed. And that their impacts on some of the key ocean sectors such as fisheries and tourism are also observed in many in almost all of the ocean basins. And the highlighted is an example for fisheries, where we are already seeing impacts across all three tropical oceans. So when we talk about these impacts, I mean, for fisheries, one of the key impacts that we are observing is the effects of changing ocean conditions on fish stocks, and that include the abundance and distribution of fish stocks. And we know that from decades of studies of biology and ecology of fish and invertebrates, is that these organisms are highly sensitive to temperature because they are ectotherms. Their body temperature is dependent on environmental temperature. So when ocean temperature increases, at the same time, they are also sensitive to loss of oxygen as well, because they need water with oxygen in order to survive. So a lot of the mobile species, when they encounter ocean warming, they may change their distribution so that they can adjust to area where they can maintain their preferred temperature. So for example, if this is a tropical species and under ocean warming, many species would shift to higher latitude regions or sometimes deeper water in order to find water bodies that can have suitable temperature for them to live. But what it means is that it will leave the area that they used to live, and that will create local extinctions, while the expansion of the range to previously not occurring area may be seen as an invasion that will create also challenges to ecosystems there. At the same time, for management, it also means that it would create challenge for things like marine protected area, where a species leaving the protected areas may affect their effectiveness, or that the species transfers between political boundaries may create international dispute in sharing of the resources. We have seen already that in the sharing of some of the pelagic fish, such as the Atlantic mackerel, that has already created international dispute as the species shift their distributions from one country to another. So in a few years ago, Professor Pauly, myself, and colleagues looked at the global fisheries catch data and tried to see whether we are already detecting this kind of shift in species distribution. What we find is that across all the large marine ecosystems in the world, we are seeing an increase in dominance of the warmer water preferred species in the fisheries catch. And if you look at this infographic, these warmer water species is depicted by the red color. The blue color fish represent the cooler water adapted species. But one thing that we find is that in the tropical ocean, because it is already the warmest ocean bodies in the whole Earth oceans. So what it means is that there's no new species moving into the tropical waters from elsewhere, but just species leaving the tropical waters. So what it means is that initially we will see a decrease in the dominance of these warm water species. And then later, the species compositions actually would stabilize, leaving behind those species that can really tolerate the hot waters, the warmer waters as the ocean warms up. And this is indicated by an index that we developed called the mean temperature of the catch. Basically, that's the average preferred temperature of the fish species in a particular year that the fisheries caught in a particular region. So the higher the mean temperature of the catch, the more the warm water species in there. Well, another well-known impacts of ocean warming, and particularly in this case with extreme events like marine heat waves, is on coral bleaching. I won't go into details to explain about what is the mechanism driving ocean coral bleaching, but just want to mention that besides the loss of these very, very variable habitats, a lot of the important fishery species actually are from coral reefs. They rely on coral reef to live and maintain their productivities. So if we have a loss of the coral habitats because of sustained marine heat waves, it also means impacts on those fish stocks that are dependent on coral reefs. And in fact, the IPCC in our assessment look at the relative risk of impacts on different key marine ecosystem or coastal marine ecosystems here in the world. And in the tropical oceans, what we find is that some of the really important and critical habitats for fish stocks, such as corals and seagrass, they are already seeing medium to high level of risk now. Like if we look at the temperature at 1 degree Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial level, which is basically now. For coral reef, we are already experiencing, the coral are already experiencing moderate to high risk of impacts, while seagrass is already experiencing moderate impacts. Even if we are good with mitigations and go to only warm up by another ½ degree Celsius, coral reef will already experience a high to very high risk of impacts, meaning that we are actually expecting that a majority of the coral reef will be largely impacted by marine heat waves and coral bleaching. And even seagrass is slightly less sensitive to corals, but then their risk will substantially increase if we are not good at mitigating climate change. So the next questions that we are asking is, with all these observed changes and the potential risk of impacts on their habitats, what will be the impacts on future seafood supply? To answer that questions, we use scenarios and models to look at how changes in ocean conditions will affect fish and invertebrates stocks around the world, and then try to assess how these changes would then affect different aspects of the blue economy or the ocean economy, including food, livelihood, and we also assess how that would affect some of the people who are relying on fish for their culture. This is a figure that is from the IPCC report, but then it is based on also large collaborations with different colleagues who use scenarios and models to look at how fish stocks and marine organisms will be changing their abundance in the 21st centuries under climate change. So we look at two climate change scenarios, one with strong mitigation scenario, the blue line, and then one with a high climate change scenario, low mitigation scenario, the red line. What across various multiple different models that we are available so far. So that's up to 6 different models that are applied at the global scale. What we find is that the average decrease in animal biomass in the global oceans is up to a loss of 1/5 of total animal biomass by the end of the century. So that's global average. We are going to lose 20% of the biomass in the ocean as projected by these models by the end of the century under the high emission scenario. But the ocean's changes are not uniform, because some part of the oceans will change in a more different ways compared to the other, and particularly in the tropical oceans. And this is a study that is led by my postdoc Gabriel Regino, and we look at the changes in the different ocean biogeochemical and physical variables, and then use it to characterize the habitats of the ocean. What we find is that under the high emission scenario, many parts of the tropical oceans will become something what we call a novel habitats, meaning that the combinations of the environmental conditions that will change in the future will make it a habitat that we haven't seen for hundreds of years. That means that animals that are living in those areas also will see that as a really strange habitat for them, because they have not experienced that for generations. So that will create a big challenge for them to adapt or adjust to those new conditions. And the result of it is that there may be large rate of local extinctions in the tropical oceans where those new habitats emerge and exist. This is a independent work then look at adding biology into the equations. So basically looking at how species abundance and distributions of over 1,000 species of exploited marine fishes and invertebrates would change their distributions in the 21st centuries under the high emission scenario in this case. If we look at the map in the lower part of this slide, it shows the rate of local extinction, meaning the number of species or the relative to the current species number that will disappear in that particular area. The red area means that we project a lot of species that will actually lose or disappear in those areas. And that's concentrated along the tropical oceans, largely because of those novel habitats where the species will find it difficult to adapt. Now, besides the distributions and the abundance of the animals, we want to also link it to the amount of fisheries catches that are available from those animals. So we look at then, in addition to temperature and other physical variables, another important variable is the net primary production, which provide the primary production carbon and energy to support the food web. And this is also a synthesis figures based on a lot of different existing model projection now. And what we find is that if you look at the map on the right-hand side, it shows the projected changes in net primary production, total animal biomass, and maximum fisheries catch potential under 2 different emission scenarios by the end of the century. And if we look at the high emission scenario, just focusing on that, and you will see a lot of the red area are concentrated along the tropical area. That indicate that in the tropics, we are projecting to see a loss in primary production, a loss in in total animal biomass, and a loss in maximum fisheries catch potential that is much more higher in intensity compared to a high latitude region. We also subsequently work with colleagues economists in our team, Dr. Myler and other colleagues to look at the subsequent impacts of these changes in catches on the economics of fishing. And what we find is that based on the economic models and combined with our biological model, and that a decrease in catches potential and supply of seafood will means an increase in price in a lot of the tropical area, as indicated by the red areas on the map in the right-hand side, on the left-hand side. So, for example, for India, we project an increase in consumer price for seafood substantially with a high emission scenario. It also means that even though there's an increase in price, it doesn't mean that it is good for the fishermen, because the increase in price didn't balance out the decrease in catch. So that means that when we multiply catch with the price, a lot of the fisheries still see a decrease in revenue. This is also challenging for communities in terms of the food supply. If we look at the countries where many people are dependent on fish as a source of animal nutrients, compared to, and then map it up with the projected change in catch potential. Information from the map that I showed you earlier on. We see that the deep blue color in the oceans actually match up really well with the red color on land. And that's really unfortunate, because the red area are area where there's high dependence on fish for food, and then the deep blue area are those areas with large projected decrease in catch potential. And that, for example, include the Indo-Pacific regions or the West African regions, where they are already facing a lot of different kinds of challenges from climate change and non-climatic impacts. So this is quite doom and gloom, and I know this is often raise a serious concerns for lots of people, particularly in tropical area, where they will be most of the evidence are pointing that they will be seeing the highest intensity of impacts from climate change on the fish stocks and fisheries. But then I think another things that we need to highlight is that there are still solutions out there that we can tackle some of the problems. This is based on the IPCC report, but then the underlying information and science behind was a paper that myself and colleagues did in looking at different kinds of solutions for climate change that are available from the ocean. And that include blue carbon. So we can subdivide the portfolio of the solutions to three types: addressing the cause of climate change, so that's mitigation. And then adaptation, so it's both supporting biological and ecological adaptations, so as on the side of the marine animals, and then on the side of marine organisms, and then social adaptation, so that's on the side of human communities. So if we look at the mitigation, so addressing the cause of climate change, that's very important. I mean, there are lots of solutions out there, and as Chair point out, it needs societal transformations. It needs changes in human behavior in order to achieve many of those goals. But then the return can be high, and if we just look at it from the sense of fisheries, if we look at this figure, which is based on our projections, the horizontal axis is the level of global warming, while the vertical axis represent the impacts on fisheries, on catch, as well as on the changes in species composition. If we go with a business as usual scenario, allowing warming of the Earth's surface to over 3 degrees Celsius or even 4 degrees Celsius, we are going to see large decrease in catch potential in the tropical area. And in this particular case, we use Indo-Pacific as an example. And also a loss of changes in distributions, particularly a loss of species diversity in the tropics. But then if we are good at mitigating carbon, achieving Paris Agreement, maintaining temperatures at 1.5 degrees Celsius warming relative to pre-industrial level, we can actually substantially reduce those impacts. If we put that in the context of an infographic like this, so if we do good mitigations, achieve Paris agreements, we are seeing in the Pacific regions, for example, only 20% decrease in catch potential compared to more than 50% decrease at a business as usual scenario. But still, there are 20% of loss of fish that we need to adapt. So it calls for both, definitely the need for mitigations, but then it also means that we still need to adapt to the impacts that we will that's likely to not be able to reduce. So there are biological adaptations and social adaptations, and there are various potential pathways for those. I won't go into details on each of those, but then I just want to highlight one aspect of adaptation is that there are often good co-benefits in many of the adaptation measures. And so what it means is that even though we need to invest into adaptations, we can get back some of the returns from these adaptation measures, not only from reducing the climate impacts, but also from other benefits that we can get from the adaptation measures. And one of the examples that I like a lot is a recent study that myself and colleague in France developed that look at the effectiveness of large pelagic fish in helping us to sequester carbon into the deep ocean. So the theory is that the big fish, like tuna, spearfish, and sharks, their body are big and heavy, so when they die, they will sink to the bottom. But then with overfishing, we are removing a lot of those big predators. So essentially removing the capacity of the oceans in helping us to bring those carbon to the deep sea floor. And when we look at these impacts from overfishing, 45% of those loss of the carbon capacity from these large ocean predators exploitation are actually driven by harmful subsidies that are already supporting these economically unprofitable pelagic fisheries. So what it means is that by removing these harmful subsidies, we can have a better, more sustainable fish stocks, and that leads to, in addition to effective fisheries management, so that we can rebuild overexploited fish stocks, so we can have more protective fisheries, but then at the same time, restore some of the capacity of these big fish to sequester carbon. So again, there's an investment in there, but then we can get return from improved fisheries management, improved fish stocks health, at the same time increasing the capacity for mitigations by these nature-based mitigation mechanism. So in conclusion, the oceans and fisheries are at a crossroads. We are seeing a lot of impacts, and that these impacts will continue. But then if we still have a variety of the solutions from mitigation, adaptation, and that if we act now, we can likely turn the tide and allow a more sustainable development of the oceans and fisheries. But then these solution space are actually limiting as we progress and slower in taking actions. So the more delay, the less effective will be these solutions. And new knowledge about the ocean, both natural and human systems, is essential because it allows us to find what are the best pathways that can guide us to sustainable ocean and support sustainable development of the society in general. So with that, thank you very much.